March 12, 1943. A printing facility in Berlin's Kreuzberg district. The smell of ink and chemical solvents filled the room as lithographic presses stamped out thousands of identical images on heavy paper stock. Workers in gray coveralls fed sheets through the machines, checking registration marks, adjusting pressure, maintaining the rhythm of industrial propaganda production. Joseph Goebbels stood at the edge of the production floor, watching the images emerge. The poster showed a skeletal figure wearing British and American uniforms, its bony hands reaching toward a map of Europe while flames consumed cities in the background. Bold Gothic text proclaimed, "Behind the Liberators, death follows." The design was meant to terrify. It reduced the Allied bombing campaign to pure destruction. It suggested that American and British forces brought only annihilation, not freedom. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, cooperation with the Reich was survival. Goebbels approved the design with a nod. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had been producing similar materials since 1939, but this campaign was different. These posters would not hang in Germany. They were destined for occupied territories, for neutral nations, for anywhere German intelligence could distribute them. The goal was to fracture Allied unity before the inevitable invasion of Europe. The first printing run produced 50,000 copies. Within 2 weeks, that number reached 500,000. German agents smuggled the posters into France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Italy. They appeared on walls in Paris, in Copenhagen, and Amsterdam. They were left in cafes, slipped into newspapers, pinned to bulletin boards in town squares. The distribution network was extensive. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had operatives throughout occupied Europe. Many were local collaborators, some were coerced civilians, others were ideological supporters of the Reich. They received bundles of posters with instructions. Display them prominently, replace them when torn down, create the impression of overwhelming German information dominance. In Paris, the posters appeared overnight on March 28. Hundreds of them, covering walls along the Seine, plastered on metro station entrances, affixed to the sides of buildings in working-class neighborhoods. French resistance fighters tore them down by morning, but more appeared the next night. The pattern repeated across the city. The poster's imagery was deliberately grotesque. The skeletal figure combined elements of the Grim Reaper with military symbolism. The flames in the background referenced recent Allied bombing raids on German cities. The reaching hands suggested invasion, occupation, destruction. Every element was calculated to provoke visceral fear. But Goebbels had miscalculated something fundamental about occupied populations. Fear of distant bombers was abstract. Fear of the German soldiers standing on street corners with machine guns was immediate. The poster asked people to fear liberation more than they feared their current oppression. In a café in the Marais district, a group of French railway workers sat at a corner table, speaking in low voices. One of them had torn down a German poster on his way to work. He spread it on the table, smoothing the creases. The men studied the image. One laughed, a short, bitter sound. "They think we fear American bombs more than German bullets?" Another man traced the skeletal figure with his finger. "They're desperate. This is the propaganda of losers." The conversation was whispered, cautious. German patrols regularly entered cafes, listening for sedition. But the poster itself became a topic of discussion across Paris. Not the discussion Goebbels intended. Instead of terrifying civilians into passive acceptance of occupation, the poster revealed German anxiety about Allied power. In Brussels, a similar pattern emerged. The posters appeared in working-class neighborhoods first, then spread to commercial districts. Belgian resistance networks documented each appearance, noted the locations, tracked the patterns. The Nazis wanted these posters seen, which meant they feared what they depicted. A resistance organizer named Edward studied one of the posters in a basement safe house. He was 47 years old, a former postal worker who had been coordinating intelligence networks since 1940. The poster lay flat on a table, illuminated by a single electric bulb. 3 other resistance members stood around the table. Edouard pointed to the skeletal hands reaching toward Europe. "Look at this. They show Allied forces as death, but see the direction of the hands? They're reaching into Reich territory. This poster admits the Allies are coming." One of the women in the group, a courier named Marie, leaned closer. "They wouldn't need to scare us if they weren't afraid themselves." Edouard folded the poster carefully. "We should keep these. Document them. When the Allies arrive, these will be evidence of German panic." The conversation was practical, analytical. The poster had failed at its primary purpose within minutes of being examined by its intended audience. Instead of submission, it prompted tactical thinking about German vulnerabilities. In Amsterdam, a Jewish family hiding in an attic listened to the woman who brought them food describe the new posters. The woman was a member of the Dutch resistance, risking execution every time she visited the hiding place. She described the skeletal figure, the flames, the Gothic text. The father of the family, a man named Samuel, asked her to bring one of the posters next time. She did, folding it small enough to conceal under her coat. Samuel unfolded it in the dim light of the attic, studied it for a long time, then smiled. They fear what's coming. This is hope. His daughter, 16 years old, had been in hiding for 14 months. She looked at the poster differently than her father. She saw the flames, the death imagery, the suggestion that liberation would bring destruction. But then she saw what her father saw, the admission that liberation was coming at all. The Nazi propaganda machine had produced millions of messages since 1933. Most were designed to glorify the Reich, to present German power as inevitable and eternal. This poster broke that pattern. It acknowledged Allied strength, admitted the possibility of invasion, revealed fear. By April 1943, the poster had spread to every major city in occupied Western Europe. German authorities replaced torn-down copies with fresh ones. The persistence suggested either confidence in the message or desperation to make it work. Resistance networks collected copies, studied them, circulated interpretations through underground newspapers. A clandestine French publication called Combat published an essay analyzing the poster. The essay was written by a philosophy professor using the pseudonym Laurent. His analysis was sharp. The occupier shows us a vision of our liberation and calls it death. This reveals their recognition that liberation is inevitable. They would not fight our hope if our hope was unfounded. The essay circulated through resistance networks across France. Copies were hand-typed, passed from person to person, read aloud in basement meetings. The poster that was meant to fracture Allied support had become a subject of intellectual resistance. In London, British intelligence received photographs of the German posters. An analyst at MI5 filed a report on April 15, 1943. The report noted the wide distribution, the consistent messaging, the apparent coordination across multiple occupied territories. The assessment concluded, the enemy is preparing populations for Allied invasion through negative framing. This suggests they believe invasion is imminent and are attempting to preemptively undermine civilian support. The poster made its way to American intelligence services through multiple channels. OSS operatives in Switzerland obtained copies. So did agents in Spain, in Sweden, in Turkey. Each copy was photographed, catalogued, analyzed for propaganda technique and strategic implications. What emerged from the analysis was a portrait of German anxiety. The poster was not a statement of strength. It was an admission of weakness disguised as intimidation. Every intelligence agency that examined it reached similar conclusions. But the most significant response to the poster came from the people it was meant to intimidate. In occupied Europe, civilians who lived under German control, who faced daily restrictions, who watched their neighbors disappear into camps, who endured years of oppression. These were the poster's target audience. And they rejected its message entirely. The poster asked them to fear their liberators. But they knew their oppressors. The choice was not abstract or complicated. German propaganda had been telling them since 1940 that the Reich would last 1,000 years, that resistance was pointless, that collaboration was wisdom. The new poster contradicted all of that. It said, the Allies are coming and we fear them. That contradiction was fatal to the poster's purpose. Once people saw that German propaganda contained fear, they recognized what that fear meant. The confident conquerors of 1940 were worried in 1943. The Reich that claimed eternal dominance was trying to frighten people away from supporting the Allies. And so the poster, instead of breaking Allied support, became evidence of German vulnerability. It circulated through resistance networks as proof that liberation was approaching. It hung in safe houses as a reminder that the war was not over, that the outcome was not predetermined, that hope remained justified. Joseph Goebbels had created a weapon without bullets. He had intended it to strike at morale, to create doubt, to fragment unity. Instead, it armed his enemies with knowledge of his fear. The poster reached England through a dozen different routes. Resistance fighters photographed copies and transmitted the images through radio networks. Downed Allied airmen smuggled copies out when they escaped occupied territory. Neutral diplomats carried them in diplomatic pouches. By late April 1943, the British government had collected hundreds of copies. The political warfare executive examined the poster as part of their counter-propaganda operations. PWE was responsible for British psychological warfare efforts, producing radio broadcasts, leaflets, and strategic messaging aimed at weakening enemy morale. They were experts at analyzing propaganda for vulnerabilities. A meeting convened on April 22 in an unmarked office building near Westminster. 6 analysts gathered around a conference table. The German poster lay in the center, its skeletal figure and Gothic text stark against the table's dark wood. The senior analyst, a former Oxford professor named Richard Crossman, lifted the poster. The Germans are telling occupied populations that we're as bad as they are. Perhaps worse. The question is why they feel compelled to make this argument now. A younger analyst, a woman named Elizabeth, responded. Because they know the populations don't believe it. This is defensive propaganda. They're losing the information war. The discussion continued for 2 hours. The analysts dissected every element, the skeleton imagery, the flames, the text, the distribution pattern. Their conclusion was unanimous. The poster revealed German strategic concerns about the coming invasion more clearly than any intelligence report could. Crossman wrote a memo to the Minister of Information. The memo recommended 3 actions: document all instances of the poster's appearance, analyze civilian reactions in occupied territories, and develop counter-propaganda that exploited the poster's defensive nature. The American Office of Strategic Services reached similar conclusions. William Donovan, director of the OSS, received a briefing on the poster in Washington on April 28. The briefing included photographs, translation of the text, analysis of distribution patterns, and preliminary assessments of civilian response. Donovan was a lawyer before the war, a decorated veteran of the First World War, and now the head of America's intelligence apparatus. He understood propaganda's role in modern warfare. He also understood that effective propaganda required believing your own message. The German poster suggested the Nazis no longer believed theirs. "They're admitting we're winning," Donovan said to his staff. "They just wrapped it in skeleton imagery and hoped nobody would notice." The OSS began tracking the poster's evolution across Europe. Operatives in the field reported each new appearance, each variation in distribution, each civilian response. The data accumulated into a portrait of a failing propaganda campaign. In France, the poster became a source of dark humor among resistance fighters. Someone drew a mustache and spectacles on the skeleton, making it resemble Hitler. Copies of this altered version circulated through Paris, a small act of ridicule that undermined the poster's menacing tone. In Belgium, resistance networks organized to tear down the posters as quickly as Germans could replace them. This created a visible contest for control of public space. The Germans persisted, but their persistence looked increasingly desperate. In the Netherlands, underground newspapers printed articles mocking the poster's imagery. One article suggested that if the Germans thought Allied liberation would bring death, perhaps they should surrender immediately to spare themselves the trouble. The satire was subtle enough to avoid immediate retaliation but sharp enough to circulate widely. The poster's message also reached Allied soldiers through intelligence briefings and captured materials. British and American troops training for the invasion of Europe learned that the Germans were trying to turn occupied populations against them before they even arrived. A briefing for U.S. Army officers in England included analysis of the poster. The briefing officer, a major named Collins, stood before a room of infantry commanders. He held up an enlarged photograph of the German propaganda. "The enemy wants the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, everyone we're coming to liberate to fear our arrival. They're telling these people that we're bringing destruction. Why? Because they know these populations are hoping for us. They know their occupation is built on fear, and they know that fear is weakening." The officers studied the image. One captain raised his hand. "Does this mean civilians will resist our landing?" Major Collins shook his head. "Intelligence indicates the opposite. The Germans wouldn't need this poster if civilian support was secure. This is what desperation looks like." The poster also appeared in neutral countries. Copies turned up in Swiss newspapers, in Swedish intelligence files, in Spanish diplomatic correspondence. Each appearance was carefully tracked by all sides. The Germans wanted neutral nations to view the Allies as destructive forces. The Allies wanted to demonstrate that German propaganda was failing. In Switzerland, a journalist named Hans wrote an article analyzing the poster for a Zurich newspaper. Switzerland maintained neutrality through careful balance, publishing perspectives from all combatants. Hans's article was technical, examining the propaganda methods without taking sides. But his conclusion was pointed. The image reveals more about its creators than its intended targets. Nations confident in victory do not need to frighten populations about future defeat. The article was reprinted in underground newspapers across occupied Europe. Neutral analysis carried weight that resistance publications could not. If Swiss journalists saw German desperation in the poster, then perhaps the poster truly revealed German weakness. In Spain, which maintained nominal neutrality while favoring the Axis powers, the poster appeared in Falangist newspapers with approving commentary. But Spanish Republicans, operating in exile and underground, circulated counterinterpretations. The poster became another battleground in Spain's continuing civil conflict. By May 1943, the German poster had evolved beyond its intended purpose. It was no longer merely propaganda. It had become a cultural artifact, a subject of analysis, a symbol interpreted differently by different audiences. The Allies saw confirmation of German anxiety. Occupied populations saw evidence that liberation was approaching. Neutral observers saw the propaganda of a regime losing confidence. Resistance fighters saw vindication of their hope. Each audience extracted meaning that contradicted German intentions. Joseph Goebbels received reports about the poster's reception. The reports were mixed. In some areas, German authorities reported that the posters remained displayed, suggesting at least passive acceptance. In other areas, the posters disappeared within hours, torn down by resistance fighters or civilians. But the real failure was subtler. The poster was not creating the fear it was designed to produce. Intelligence reports filtering back to Berlin indicated that occupied populations were interpreting the poster as evidence of German weakness, not Allied danger. Goebbels faced a choice. He could withdraw the poster admitting failure. Or he could persist, hoping that repetition would eventually achieve the desired effect. He chose persistence. Printing continued. Distribution intensified. More copies appeared in more locations. This decision revealed a fundamental flaw in totalitarian propaganda. It assumed that controlling the message meant controlling its interpretation. It assumed that if you told people something often enough, loudly enough, they would believe it. But occupied populations had learned to read propaganda critically. Years of Nazi messaging had taught them to identify fear masked as confidence, desperation disguised as strength. They had become sophisticated consumers of propaganda, analyzing it for what it revealed rather than accepting what it claimed. The poster was meant to be a weapon. It became a gift. It gave the resistance movements evidence to support their arguments. It gave Allied intelligence insight into German strategic thinking. It gave occupied civilians reason to believe their suffering would end. In London, the political warfare executive began developing counter-propaganda. They printed leaflets showing the German poster alongside text that explained its true meaning. The Germans fear your liberation so much they try to make you fear it too. Their fear is justified. Yours is not. These counter-leaflets were airdropped over France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Not in massive quantities but enough to circulate. Enough to reach the people who had seen the German poster and wondered what to think. The propaganda war had shifted. The Germans had created a message intended to weaken Allied support. The Allies had turned that message into evidence of German weakness. The contest was no longer about who could shout louder. It was about who could interpret reality more credibly. And on that battlefield the Germans were losing. In a studio apartment in Montmartre, Paris, an artist named Marcel worked by candlelight. The electricity had been cut again, another collective punishment for neighborhood resistance activity. He sat at a small table working with pen and ink, transforming the German skeleton poster into something else. Marcel was 34 years old, a commercial illustrator before the war who now created false documents for the resistance. Identity papers, travel permits, ration cards. His hand was steady, his forgeries undetectable. But tonight he was not forging documents. He was creating art. He had obtained one of the German posters the day before, peeling it carefully from a wall near the Sacré-Cœur. Now he was working on a response. His version kept the skeletal figure but changed the uniform. Instead of British and American emblems, the skeleton wore a Nazi armband. The reaching hands no longer grasped at Europe but clawed at emptiness. The flames in the background remained, but he added Soviet tanks and American bombers. The revised poster inverted the German message entirely. The skeleton became the Reich itself, death in Nazi uniform, reaching for territory it could no longer hold while Allied forces closed in. Marcel worked for 3 hours, getting every detail precise. Then he created a printing plate using techniques he had taught himself. By morning he had produced 20 copies of the altered poster. They were not perfect reproductions but they were effective. The message was clear. The Germans had created propaganda that could be turned against them. Marcel distributed the posters through resistance networks. They appeared on walls across Montmartre, usually beside the German originals. Passers-by could see both versions, could understand the visual argument being made. The conversation happened in images rather than words, safer in a city where spoken resistance could mean execution. German authorities noticed the altered posters within days. They dispatched teams to remove them but more appeared. The pattern suggested organization which meant resistance networks. The Gestapo investigated, interrogated suspects, made arrests. But the altered posters kept appearing. The struggle over the posters' meaning became a contest for narrative control. The Germans said, "Fear the Allies." Marcel and others like him said, "Fear the Reich." The occupied population watched this visual argument unfold on their streets and made their own judgments. In Amsterdam, a graphic designer named Sophie created a different response. She was 26 years old, working in hiding since 1942 when the Germans began deporting Jews from the Netherlands. Her family had been taken. She remained, protected by Dutch resistance members who gave her false papers and a room in an attic. Sophie obtained a German poster through her resistance contacts. She studied it for days, analyzing the artistic choices. The Gothic font, the skeletal imagery, the composition. She understood what made it visually effective. She also understood how to subvert it. Her response poster showed the same skeleton, but she added a second figure, a mirror image wearing a Nazi uniform. The two figures faced each other, identical except for their uniforms. The text read, "Death has no nationality." The message was more subtle than Marcel's revision. Sophie was not arguing that one side was righteous and the other evil. She was suggesting that war itself was the enemy, that the skeleton represented all violence regardless of uniform. Her poster circulated through intellectual resistance circles, among professors, students, writers who saw war as a universal tragedy. The different artistic responses to the German poster reflected different resistance philosophies. Some groups wanted to directly counter German propaganda with opposite claims. Others wanted to transcend the binary arguments entirely. But all responses shared one characteristic. They treated the German poster not as truth but as material to be interrogated, challenged, transformed. In Brussels, a collective of artists created a series of posters responding to the German campaign. Each artist worked in their own style, producing unique interpretations. One showed the skeleton with puppet strings attached, labeled with Propaganda Ministry. Another showed the skeleton looking into a mirror and seeing Hitler's face. A third showed the skeleton collapsing under the weight of Allied bombs and Soviet tanks. These artists worked in secret, printing their work in basement print shops, distributing through resistance networks. Some were caught. The Gestapo interrogated them about their sources, their collaborators, their distribution methods. Some gave up information under torture. Others died without speaking. But the posters kept appearing. The German response to these counter-propaganda efforts was telling. Initially, authorities tried to suppress the altered posters as quickly as they appeared. Teams of soldiers patrolled neighborhoods, tearing down anything that contradicted official messaging. But this created its own problem. The more aggressively Germans removed counter-propaganda, the more they demonstrated its effectiveness. By June 1943, German authorities in Paris adopted a new strategy. Instead of removing altered posters, they left them up but placed official notices beneath them warning that creating or distributing anti-Reich propaganda was punishable by death. The notices listed recent executions as examples. This approach failed differently than the previous one. The death threats made clear how seriously the Germans took the visual argument. If altered posters were meaningless, why threaten execution? The threats validated the posters' importance, suggesting they genuinely threatened German control. A resistance organizer in Belgium named François analyzed this dynamic in a report to his network. They cannot win the poster war. Removing our responses makes them look afraid. Leaving our responses up makes them look weak. Threatening us over images makes the images more powerful. They have created a propaganda trap for themselves. François' analysis circulated through resistance networks across occupied Europe. It articulated what many had sensed but not yet expressed. The German poster campaign had opened a vulnerability that resistance movements were exploiting. The artistic responses to the poster were not merely reactive. They were actively reshaping how occupied populations thought about liberation, about resistance, about the war's outcome. Each altered poster was an argument in visual form. The Germans are lying, the Allies are coming, hope is justified. In Lyon, a group of art students created a poster showing the German skeleton transformed into a scarecrow in a field, tattered and ineffective, with birds perched on its outstretched arms. The image suggested that German threats were hollow, that fear was no longer working as a tool of control. The students printed 50 copies and distributed them across the city in a single night. By morning, German authorities had removed most of them, but photographs had been taken, copies made. The scarecrow image spread to other cities, appearing in Marseille, in Toulouse, in Bordeaux. This pattern repeated across occupied territories. Artists created responses to German propaganda, distributed them, watched German authorities struggle to contain the spread. Each cycle weakened German information control slightly. The cumulative effect was significant. The poster war was not decisive in military terms. It did not change battlefield outcomes or strategic decisions. But it changed something more fundamental. It shifted the narrative about who was winning. German propaganda had claimed inevitable victory since 1940. The poster campaign and the resistance response revealed that narrative as false. Occupied populations began to believe that liberation was not just possible but approaching. This belief changed behavior. More people joined resistance networks. More information flowed to Allied intelligence. More acts of sabotage disrupted German operations. The poster war contributed to these shifts, not as a sole cause but as one factor among many. By late summer 1943, even German authorities recognized the poster campaign had failed. Internal memos from regional Gauleiter in France and Belgium reported that the posters were counterproductive, that they were being used as resistance propaganda, that they should be withdrawn. But withdrawing the posters would require admitting failure. So they remained on walls, fading in the sun, torn at the edges, sometimes altered by artists, sometimes left alone, always serving as evidence that German propaganda could be challenged, resisted, defeated. The artists who created counter-propaganda were not professional propagandists. They were commercial illustrators, graphic designers, art students, people who understood visual communication and chose to use those skills against occupation. Their work was risky, often fatal when discovered, but also effective in ways that armed resistance could not achieve. They changed minds. They shifted perceptions. They turned German propaganda into a weapon against its creators. And they did this with ink, paper, and the understanding that in a war of information, meaning is never fixed, messages can always be reinterpreted, and the side that controls interpretation controls more than the side that controls printing presses. General Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the German poster for the first time on May 8, 1943, during a briefing at Allied Force headquarters in Algiers. His intelligence staff had prepared a presentation on Axis propaganda efforts in occupied Europe. The poster was discussed as part of that briefing. Eisenhower studied the image. He was a practical man focused on logistics, coordination, the complex machinery of military operations. But he understood that wars were fought in minds as well as on battlefields. The German poster was an attempt to fight in that psychological space. After the briefing, Eisenhower asked a question. What are the civilians in occupied territories saying about this? The intelligence officer, a colonel named Williams, consulted his notes. Reports from resistance networks indicate the poster is being interpreted as evidence of German anxiety about Allied invasion. In many areas, civilians are viewing it as unintentional encouragement. Eisenhower nodded. The Germans are telling people we're coming. That's accurate. They're trying to make people afraid of that. That's failing. How do we exploit this? The question launched a series of planning sessions focused on psychological operations. If German propaganda was creating opportunities, Allied forces needed strategies to capitalize on them. The poster became a case study in how to turn enemy messaging against itself. The Psychological Warfare Division of SHEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, developed a multi-part response. First, they created leaflets acknowledging the German poster directly. The leaflets showed photographs of the poster alongside text. The Germans tell you to fear your liberation because they fear it themselves. These leaflets were airdropped over France beginning in June 1943. Not in enormous quantities, but targeted drops in areas where the German poster had appeared most frequently. The goal was to reach people who had seen the German propaganda and provide an alternative interpretation. Second, the Psychological Warfare Division worked with resistance networks to distribute more detailed counter-propaganda. These materials included photographs of German atrocities, testimonies from refugees, documentation of deportations and executions. The materials asked a simple question: who should you really fear? Third, they incorporated the poster into training materials for Allied troops. Soldiers preparing for the invasion of Europe learned that they would be entering territories where German propaganda had tried to turn civilians against them. They were taught to understand civilian fears, to demonstrate through their behavior that they were liberators not occupiers, to be aware that their actions would be judged against German propaganda claims. A training manual distributed to U.S. Army units included a section on enemy propaganda and civilian relations. The manual showed the skeleton poster and explained, "The enemy has told occupied populations that we bring death. Your conduct must prove this false. Discipline, respect for civilians and humanitarian behavior are not just moral requirements, they are strategic necessities." The British Army created similar training materials. Field manuals for troops preparing to enter France included guidance on how to interact with civilians who had been subjected to years of German propaganda. The skeleton poster was used as an example of how fear had been weaponized and how Allied behavior could counteract that fear. In North Africa, where Allied forces had already liberated territories from Axis control, after-action reports examined how soldiers had dealt with populations that had been exposed to Axis propaganda. These reports fed into planning for the invasion of Europe. One report from Tunisia described how American troops had encountered civilians who initially feared them due to Italian propaganda. The report detailed how soldiers had built trust through small actions, sharing food, providing medical care, respecting local customs, demonstrating through behavior that propaganda lies were just that, lies. This operational experience informed psychological warfare planning. The skeleton poster was not just a propaganda piece to counter with more propaganda. It was evidence of civilian fears that needed to be addressed through action as well as words. Meanwhile, Soviet forces advancing from the east encountered their own version of German propaganda about Allied intentions. German materials distributed in Ukraine and Belarus showed similar skeletal imagery, claiming that both Western and Soviet forces would destroy occupied populations. The Soviet response was characteristically direct. They pushed forward, liberated territories, and let their actions speak. But the Soviets also engaged in their own propaganda efforts. Soviet leaflets dropped over German-occupied territories showed photographs of Red Army soldiers helping civilians, rebuilding schools, distributing food. The message was simple: liberation is not destruction. The coordination between Western allies and Soviet forces on psychological operations was limited, but there was recognition that German propaganda was trying to divide the alliance by portraying all Allied forces as equally destructive. Countering this required demonstrating Allied unity as well as Allied humanitarian principles. In London, the Special Operations Executive worked with resistance networks to prepare for the invasion. Part of that preparation involved ensuring that civilians in occupied territories would support Allied forces when they arrived rather than fear them. The German skeleton poster had complicated that task by trying to create fear in advance. SOE operatives training resistance fighters emphasized that every act of resistance helped counter German propaganda. Sabotage operations that disrupted German logistics, intelligence gathering that helped Allied planning, rescue operations that saved downed airmen, all of these activities demonstrated that occupied populations were active participants in their own liberation, not passive victims waiting for destruction. A briefing document for SOE agents included analysis of the skeleton poster. The document noted, enemy propaganda attempts to portray Allied liberation as equivalent to Axis occupation. Our agents must help civilians understand the fundamental difference. We come to free them, not to enslave them. This difference must be demonstrated through support for resistance activities and eventual liberation operations. By August 1943, military planning for the invasion of Europe was well underway. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was still months away, but psychological preparation was ongoing. The German poster campaign had created both challenges and opportunities. The challenge was overcoming fear that German propaganda had tried to instill. The opportunity was exploiting the fact that the propaganda had backfired, creating expectations of liberation that Allied forces would need to fulfill. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces, addressed his officers about the psychological dimensions of the coming invasion. He spoke bluntly, "The Germans have spent years brutalizing occupied populations. Now they're telling these people that we'll be worse. We will prove them wrong through our conduct. Discipline will be absolute. Looting will be punished. Respect for civilians is not optional. We are liberators and we will behave as such." American commanders issued similar guidance. General Omar Bradley emphasized that every soldier was a representative of American values in occupied Europe. Their behavior would determine whether liberation was welcomed or resisted. The military response to the German poster campaign was thus multi-layered. It included counter-propaganda, troop training, coordination with resistance networks, and plans for post-invasion conduct. All of these elements recognized that the war was not just about defeating German military forces but about winning the trust of occupied populations that had been subjected to years of propaganda. The skeleton poster had tried to preemptively undermine that trust. The Allied response was to build trust through preparation, through messaging, through coordination with resistance movements, and ultimately through the behavior of soldiers when they finally entered occupied territories. The Germans had tried to use fear as a weapon. The Allies prepared to use hope, backed by humanitarian conduct, as a counter. The poster war was about to become a test of which approach more accurately reflected reality. By September 1943, the German skeleton poster had taken on meanings its creators never intended. In occupied France, resistance fighters began using the skeleton image as a symbol of German propaganda itself, a representation of hollow threats and desperate messaging. A clandestine newspaper in Paris called Liberation published a satirical article about the poster. The article was written in the style of an art critique, analyzing the poster's composition, use of color, symbolic elements. The critique concluded that the poster was a masterpiece of unintentional honesty. The image of death in military uniform is an accurate representation of Nazi occupation, though not in the way its creators intended. The article circulated through resistance networks. Copies reached London, where they were read with interest by the political warfare executive. The analysis demonstrated how effectively occupied populations had rejected German propaganda framing. The skeleton intended to represent Allied liberation was being reinterpreted as a representation of Nazi rule. In Belgium, the poster became a recruiting tool for resistance movements. New recruits were shown the German propaganda and asked, "Do you believe this?" The consistent answer was no. The poster's presence in recruitment spaces turned it into evidence of why resistance was necessary. German propaganda was not just false, it was insulting in its assumption that occupied populations could be so easily manipulated. Underground printing presses in multiple cities began producing small pins and badges showing simplified versions of the skeleton image. These were distributed to resistance members as identification symbols, ways to recognize each other in public spaces. The original German image had been transformed into a resistance emblem. The transformation was ironic and powerful. The Nazis had created an image meant to terrify. That image was now being worn by the people who actively fought against Nazi control. The symbol had been captured, recontextualized, and turned into its opposite. German authorities noticed this development by October 1943. Internal security reports from occupied territories noted that the skeleton image was appearing in resistance materials. The reports recommended discontinuing the poster campaign entirely. But by this point, the posters were already distributed throughout occupied Europe. Removing them would require massive effort and would itself signal defeat. Joseph Goebbels faced a problem with no good solution. Continuing the campaign meant accepting that the posters had become resistance symbols. Discontinuing it meant admitting failure. He chose a middle path. He ordered printing stopped but did not order removal of existing posters. They would remain until they decayed naturally or were replaced with other propaganda materials. This decision meant the skeleton poster would continue appearing on walls for months, even years in some areas. Each poster that remained became a time capsule of German propaganda failure, a reminder that information control was no longer absolute. In the Netherlands, a Protestant minister used the poster in a sermon. This was dangerous. German authorities monitored churches closely, especially Protestant churches that had sometimes resisted Nazi racial policies. But the minister was careful in his language. He spoke about the image of death in the poster, about how death was humanity's common enemy, about how war brought death regardless of which army wore which uniform. He did not explicitly criticize German propaganda or praise the Allies. But his congregation understood the subtext. The skeleton represented war itself, and the end of war meant the end of occupation. The sermon was reported to German authorities by an informant. The minister was questioned but not arrested. His carefully chosen words had given him just enough plausible deniability. But the sermon circulated anyway, transcribed and distributed through resistance networks, reaching audiences far beyond his church. The poster's transformation into a multivalent symbol happened because occupied populations were active interpreters, not passive recipients of propaganda. They took German messaging and extracted different meanings aligned with their own understanding of the war and their own hopes for its outcome. By early 1944, as Allied invasion preparations intensified, the poster had largely disappeared from German propaganda efforts. New campaigns focused on different messages. Promises of new wonder weapons, threats against collaborators with resistance movements, claims about the Bolshevik threat from the East. The skeleton poster had served its purpose, though not the purpose intended. But the poster's legacy continued in unexpected ways. Allied psychological warfare specialists studied it as a case example of propaganda failure. Training materials for information operations officers included analysis of what went wrong with the German campaign, misunderstanding the audience, underestimating resistance sophistication, creating messages that could be easily inverted. A report by the Psychological Warfare Division titled, Analysis of Axis Propaganda Failures, devoted an entire section to the skeleton poster. The report concluded, the poster failed because it asked occupied populations to fear their liberation more than their occupation. This was psychologically implausible given lived experience of Nazi control. The campaign reveals enemy anxiety about Allied invasion while attempting to create anxiety in target populations about the same. This contradiction made the propaganda vulnerable to reinterpretation and subversion. The report became required reading for Allied information operations officers. The skeleton poster was transformed one final time, from failed propaganda to educational example, a lesson in how not to conduct psychological operations. Meanwhile, in the territories still under German occupation, the few remaining skeleton posters had become part of the visual landscape. Torn, faded, sometimes defaced with graffiti, they were monuments to a propaganda campaign that had backfired completely. Some resistance members made a practice of photographing the posters in their deteriorated state. These photographs were kept as records, as documentation of German psychological warfare efforts, as evidence for future war crimes trials. The posters were treated as historical artifacts even while the war continued. In one photograph from Brussels, taken in March 1944, a torn skeleton poster hangs on a wall beside Allied propaganda leaflets that had been airdropped. The juxtaposition was stark. German propaganda showing death in Allied uniform, Allied materials showing photographs of liberated Italian cities with civilians celebrating. The visual argument could not have been clearer. The transformation of the poster from weapon to symbol to lesson was complete. What began as an attempt to fracture Allied support had become evidence of Allied strength and German weakness. What was meant to create fear had inspired hope. What was designed to divide had helped unite occupied populations in their rejection of German propaganda. The skeleton poster did not change the war's outcome. Military operations, strategic decisions, industrial capacity, and the courage of millions of soldiers and civilians determined that. But the poster revealed something important about the limits of propaganda. Controlling the message did not mean controlling its meaning, and in a war of information, the audience always had the final interpretation. June 6, 1944. Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion that German propaganda had tried to frame as destruction was underway. In occupied France, civilians who had lived under Nazi control for 4 years waited to see which version of the future would arrive: the skeletal death promised by German posters, or the liberation offered by Allied messaging. The first encounters between Allied soldiers and French civilians were tentative. Years of occupation had taught caution. German authorities had spent weeks intensifying propaganda about Allied intentions, warning that American and British soldiers would loot, would destroy, would treat the French as conquered people rather than liberated allies. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first French communities liberated on D-Day, American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division encountered civilians emerging from their homes. The soldiers had been trained in basic French phrases. They had been instructed to be respectful, to demonstrate through their behavior that they were liberators. A paratrooper named Robert offered chocolate to a young French girl. It was a small gesture, one repeated by soldiers throughout history. But it was also a direct contradiction of German propaganda. The skeleton poster had promised death. The American soldier offered chocolate. News of the liberation spread through resistance networks. Radio broadcasts from London confirmed that Allied forces were advancing from the beaches. Underground newspapers printed special editions announcing that the invasion had begun. And everywhere the German skeleton posters still hanging on walls looked increasingly absurd. In Paris, which would not be liberated until August, resistance members photographed the posters beside scrawled messages. They were wrong. Liberation is coming. The photographs circulated through underground networks, evidence that German propaganda had failed not just strategically but specifically, concretely, in real time. The advancing Allied armies encountered the posters frequently. They hung in towns across Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire Valley. Some soldiers photographed them, curious about what Germans had told the French about American and British forces. The photographs were sent home, appearing in American and British newspapers with captions explaining German propaganda efforts. One photograph appeared in the New York Times on June 14, 1944. It showed an American soldier standing next to a German skeleton poster. The soldier was smiling, offering a thumbs-up gesture. The caption read, "American GI poses with German propaganda poster warning French civilians about Allied liberators." Reality proves different. The image circulated widely. It became one of many photographs demonstrating the gap between German propaganda claims and Allied reality. The skeleton poster had promised death. The photograph showed an American soldier demonstrating the opposite. As Allied forces advanced, they were accompanied by civil affairs officers trained to work with liberated populations. These officers had studied German propaganda efforts, including the skeleton poster campaign. Their job was to help rebuild civil administration, distribute food and medical supplies, and begin the process of transitioning from occupation to liberation. Major Sarah Thompson, a civil affairs officer with the British Army, entered the town of Cannes in mid-July after weeks of fierce fighting. The town was heavily damaged by the battle, but civilians had survived in cellars and bomb shelters. As they emerged, Thompson's unit began providing assistance. Thompson noticed German posters still hanging on walls, including several skeleton posters. She ordered them photographed for intelligence purposes but left them in place temporarily. "Let people see that the Germans lied," she told her staff. "They promised destruction if we came. We're here and we're helping." The contrast between German propaganda and Allied reality was stark. While German posters had promised death, Allied forces brought food, medical care, and restoration of civil order. The gap between promise and reality helped cement civilian support for the liberation. French resistance fighters who had fought the Germans for years watched this unfold with satisfaction. The posters they had seen as evidence of German fear in 1943 were now evidence of German lies in 1944. The propaganda that was supposed to turn them against the Allies had instead revealed how little Germans understood about occupied populations. In Belgium, where Allied forces arrived in September 1944, a similar pattern emerged. German skeleton posters hung in Brussels, Antwerp, and smaller towns. As British and American troops entered these cities, civilians tore down the posters themselves, often while cheering for their liberators. A British soldier named James wrote home describing the scene in Brussels. "The Belgians were pulling down German posters that showed us as skeletons bringing death. They were laughing while they did it. Children were dancing in the streets. The Germans had tried to make them afraid of us. Instead, they were afraid of the Germans leaving." The liberation process was not uniformly smooth. There were instances of misconduct by Allied soldiers, of looting and assault. Military police enforced discipline, courts-martial were held, and officers worked to ensure that soldier behavior aligned with liberation principles rather than occupation patterns. But overall, the contrast between German propaganda and Allied conduct was favorable to the Allies. The skeleton poster had set a low bar. If you are not death incarnate, you exceed expectations. Allied forces, while imperfect, demonstrated that they were not the skeletal destroyers German propaganda had portrayed. In the Netherlands, where liberation came later and in stages, German authorities made a final attempt to use the skeleton poster concept. In September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, new posters appeared showing Allied paratroopers as harbingers of destruction. But by this point, the credibility of German propaganda had collapsed. Civilians ignored the new posters or actively removed them. The propaganda war was over. Reality had adjudicated the competing claims. German posters had promised that Allied liberation would bring death. Instead, liberation brought the end of occupation, the restoration of civil society, and the beginning of reconstruction. After the war ended in May 1945, historians and analysts began examining the role of propaganda in the conflict. The German skeleton poster campaign became a case study in how psychological operations could backfire when they misunderstood their audience. Professor Elisabeth Noel, a German sociologist who would later found the Allensbach Institute for Public Opinion Research, interviewed civilians in occupied territories about their responses to German propaganda. Her work was part of broader efforts to understand how totalitarian propaganda functioned and why it sometimes failed. In her interviews, conducted in late 1945 and early 1946, Noel asked French, Belgian, and Dutch civilians about the skeleton poster specifically. The responses were remarkably consistent. Most remembered the poster. Most had interpreted it as evidence of German fear about Allied invasion. Few had taken its message at face value. One interview subject, a French woman named Juliette who had been part of the resistance in Lyon, summarized the common response. They told us the Allies would bring death. We looked around at the Germans who had occupied us for 4 years, who had deported our neighbors, who had executed anyone who resisted. We thought, how could the Allies be worse than this? Noel's research documented a fundamental principle of propaganda. Messages must align with lived experience to be credible. The skeleton poster asked people to fear a hypothetical future more than they feared their present reality. This was psychologically implausible. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence services compiled reports on Axis propaganda efforts. The skeleton poster appeared in multiple reports as an example of failed psychological warfare. Analysis focused on why the campaign had not achieved its objectives. A CIA report from 1948 titled, Lessons from Axis Psychological Operations, included a section on the poster. The report identified 3 critical errors. First, the poster underestimated the sophistication of occupied populations. Second, it revealed German anxiety about Allied invasion, weakening rather than strengthening German psychological position. Third, it created a message that could be easily inverted and used by resistance movements. The report concluded, effective propaganda requires understanding your audience's lived experience and cognitive framework. Messaging that contradicts obvious reality, no matter how frequently repeated, will fail when audiences have independent sources of information and strong motivations to reject the message. These analytical reports became foundational texts for Cold War psychological operations. Both American and Soviet intelligence services studied World War II propaganda campaigns to understand what worked and what failed. The skeleton poster was filed alongside other cases. German propaganda that backfired, Allied psychological operations that succeeded, the complex relationship between messaging and reality. In Germany itself, during the denazification process, the skeleton poster appeared in exhibitions about Nazi propaganda. The exhibitions were designed to help Germans understand how propaganda had functioned in the Reich, how information had been manipulated, how fear had been weaponized. One exhibition in Berlin in 1946 displayed the skeleton poster alongside testimony from resistance fighters about how they had interpreted it. The contrast was educational. The poster that was meant to create fear had inspired resistance. The exhibition was part of broader efforts to help Germans understand why the Reich had failed. Joseph Goebbels, who had approved the skeleton poster campaign in 1943, was dead by suicide in May 1945. He left behind extensive diaries that were later published. Entries from 1943 and 1944 showed his growing awareness that German propaganda was losing effectiveness, that occupied populations no longer believed Reich messaging, that the psychological war was being lost even as military battles continued. But Goebbels never specifically mentioned the skeleton poster in his diary entries. Perhaps he did not recognize its failure as significant. Perhaps he understood that individual propaganda campaigns mattered less than the overall credibility problem German messaging faced. By 1944, German propaganda struggled to overcome the gap between its claims and observable reality. The poster appeared occasionally in post-war art and cultural commentary. A French film from 1949 about the resistance included a scene showing resistance members laughing at the German skeleton poster. A Belgian novel from 1951 featured a character who keeps one of the posters as a reminder of German propaganda attempts. These cultural representations treated the poster as a historical artifact, a symbol of a particular moment when German authorities had tried to preemptively undermine liberation by making people fear it. The cultural consensus was clear: the attempt had failed. In academic settings, the poster became a teaching tool. Courses on propaganda analysis used it to demonstrate how propaganda could backfire. Communications departments, political science programs, and intelligence training academies incorporated the skeleton poster into curricula about psychological operations. A textbook on propaganda published in 1952 included the poster as a case study. The textbook asked students to analyze why the campaign failed, to identify the strategic errors, to consider what alternative approaches might have been more effective. The poster had been transformed from contemporary propaganda to historical lesson. Meanwhile, the artist who had created counter-propaganda during the war received recognition. Marcel, the Parisian illustrator who had inverted the skeleton poster, survived the war and resumed his career. After the war, he created a series of paintings about the resistance, including one that showed both the original German poster and his altered version side by side. The painting was exhibited in Paris in 1947. Critics praised it as a representation of how occupied populations had fought back against propaganda. Marcel was modest about his wartime work, but he understood its significance. In an interview he said, "We could not fight with guns against tanks. But we could fight with art against propaganda. And we won that war." Sophie, the Dutch designer who created the "Death Has No Nationality" response, did not survive. She was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 and died in a concentration camp. But her poster survived, kept by resistance members who had worked with her. After the war, it was displayed in a museum exhibition about resistance art. The surviving resistance members who had fought the propaganda war remained proud of their work. In reunions and memoirs, they spoke about how they had challenged German information control, how they had turned propaganda into resistance tools, how they had helped maintain hope during occupation. The skeleton poster's post-war history was thus multiple. It was an intelligence case study, a museum artifact, a teaching tool, an artistic inspiration, a memory of resistance. All of these roles emerged from its original purpose as propaganda. But that original purpose had failed so completely that the poster's main legacy was as evidence of failure. 70 years after the skeleton poster appeared on walls across occupied Europe, it exists primarily in archives and museums. Original copies are preserved in institutions like the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Imperial War Museum in London, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Historians occasionally examine them as part of research into propaganda and psychological warfare. But the poster's legacy extends beyond physical artifacts. It represents a lesson that remains relevant in any era when information warfare is a component of conflict. Propaganda is not magic. It cannot make people believe the implausible. It cannot overcome contradictions with reality. And when it tries, it often backfires in ways that strengthen rather than weaken the opposition. The skeleton poster tried to make occupied populations fear liberation more than they feared occupation. This was psychologically impossible given that these populations experienced occupation daily and understood its costs. The propaganda asked for a leap of imagination that contradicted lived experience. That failure teaches something about the limits of messaging. In modern conflicts, information operations remain crucial. But effective information operations require understanding audiences, aligning messaging with observable reality, and recognizing that sophisticated populations will interpret propaganda critically rather than accept it passively. The poster also demonstrated how propaganda can reveal more than it intends. By trying to make people fear Allied invasion, the Germans admitted that invasion was coming, that it threatened German control, that they were worried about its consequences. This unintentional admission undermined the broader German propaganda narrative about invincible Reich power. Resistance movements learned from the poster how to read propaganda for what it revealed rather than what it claimed. This skill in critical interpretation became a form of resistance itself, a way to find hope and agency even when surrounded by enemy messaging. The artists who responded to the poster showed that propaganda wars are never one-sided. Any message can be challenged, reinterpreted, subverted. Visual arguments can be countered with alternative visual arguments. Symbols can be captured and transformed. The side that controls printing presses does not necessarily control meaning. In 2014, on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, a French museum exhibited original German skeleton posters alongside resistance counter-propaganda. Visitors could see both the original message and how it had been challenged, could understand the visual conversation that had occurred on walls across occupied Europe. An elderly French woman visiting the exhibit paused before the posters. She had been a child during the occupation, had grown up seeing German propaganda, had lived through liberation. She studied the skeleton image for a long time, then turned to her grandson and said, "They tried to make us afraid. We were already afraid, but not of the Allies. We were afraid of them. They never understood that." Her comment captured the poster's fundamental failure. It misidentified the source of fear. Occupied populations feared the occupiers, not the liberators. No amount of propaganda could reverse that reality. The skeleton poster remains in historical memory as a case study in failed propaganda, in how psychological operations can backfire, in how occupied populations resisted not just with weapons but with interpretation and art and determination to find hope despite messaging designed to destroy it. The poster that was meant to break Allied support instead became evidence of Allied strength. The image that was meant to terrify instead inspired resistance. The propaganda that was meant to divide instead demonstrated unity. These inversions happened because the poster's creators fundamentally misunderstood their audience. In the end, the propaganda poster did exactly the opposite of what was intended. It united the enemy it was meant to divide. It strengthened the resolve it was meant to break. It revealed the fear it was meant to project. And in doing so, it became a lesson that echoes through history. In wars of information, the audience always has the final word. The skeleton poster hangs in museums now, protected behind glass, a relic of a conflict that ended generations ago. But its lesson remains current. Propaganda that contradicts reality will fail. Messages that reveal more than they intend will be exploited. And populations subjected to psychological warfare are not passive recipients but active interpreters who will find their own meanings regardless of what propagandists intend. The poster was a weapon that backfired. And in backfiring, it taught us something valuable about the limits of information control, the resilience of human interpretation, and the persistent truth that fear cannot be manufactured when hope has evidence on its side.